Paul's two epistles to the Thessalonians, the first two he wrote by inspiration, give such a shining character of that church, that we cannot but be glad here in the history to meet with an account of the first founding of the church there. Here is Paul's coming to Thessalonica, which was the chief city of this country, called at this day Salonesh, in the Turkish dominions. Paul went on with his work, notwithstanding the ill usage he had met with at Philippi. He did not fail, nor was discouraged. He takes notice of this in his first epistle to the church here, 1th2:2. After we were shamefully treated at Philippi, yet we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God. The opposition and persecution that he met with made him the more resolute. Note of these things moved him. He could never have held out, and held on, as he did, if he had not been animated by a spirit of power from on high. He did but pass through Amphipolis and Apollonia, the former a city near Philippi, the latter near Thessalonica. Doubtless he was under divine direction, and was told by the Spirit, who, as the wind, bloweth where he listeth, what places he should pass through, and what he should rest in. Apollonia was a city of Illyricum, which, some think, illustrates that of Paul, that he had preached the gospel from Jerusalem, and round about unto Illyricum, Rom 15:19, that is, to the borders of Illyricum where he now was. And we may suppose, though he is said only to pass through these cities, yet that he stayed so long in them as to publish the gospel there, and to prepare the way for the entrance of other ministers among them, whom he would afterwards send. His preaching to the Jews first, in their synagogue at Thessalonica. He found a synagogue of the Jews there, v1, which intimates that one reason why he passed through those other cities mentioned, and did not continue long in them, was because there were no synagogues in them. But, finding one in Thessalonica, by it he made his entry. It was always his manner to begin with the Jews, to make them the first offer of the gospel, and not to turn to the Gentiles till they had refused it, that their mouths might be stopped from clamoring against him because he preached to the Gentiles, for if they received the gospel they would cheerfully embrace the new converts. If they refused it, they might thank themselves if the apostles carried it to those that would bid it welcome. That command of beginning at Jerusalem was justly construed as a direction, wherever they came, to begin with the Jews. He met them in their synagogue on the Sabbath day, in their place and at their time of meeting, and thus he would pay respect to both. Sabbaths and solemn assemblies are always very precious to those to whom Christ is precious. PS 84:10. It is good being in the house of the Lord on his day. This was Christ's manner, and Paul's manner, and has been the manner of all the saints, the good old way which they have walked in. He reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. They agreed with him to receive the Scriptures of the Old Testament, so far they were of a mind. But they received the Scripture, and therefore thought they had reason to reject Christ. Paul received the Scripture, and therefore saw great reason to embrace Christ. It was therefore requisite, in order to their conviction, that he should, by reasoning with them, the Spirit setting with him, convince them that his inferences from the Scripture were right and theirs were wrong. Note, the preaching of the gospel should be both scriptural preaching and rational. Such Paul's was, for he reasoned out of the Scriptures. We must take the Scriptures for our foundation, our oracle and touchstone, and then reason out of them and upon them, and against those who, though they pretend zeal for the Scriptures, as the Jews did, yet wrest them to their own destruction. Reason must not be set up in competition with the Scripture, but it must be made use of in explaining and applying the Scripture. He continued to do this 3 Sabbath days successively. If he could not convince them the first Sabbath, he would try the second and the third, for precept must be upon precept, and line upon line. God waits for sinners' conversion, and so must his ministers. All the laborers come not into the vineyard at the first hour, nor at the first call, nor are wrought upon so suddenly as the jailer. The drift and scope of his preaching and arguing was to prove that Jesus is the Christ. This was that which he opened and alleged. v3. He first explained his thesis, and opened the terms, and then alleged it, and laid it down, as that which he would abide by, and which he summoned them in God's name to subscribe to. Paul had an admirable method of discourse, and showed he was himself both well apprised of the doctrine he preached and thoroughly understood it, and that he was fully assured of the truth of it, and therefore he opened it like one that believed it. He showed them that it was necessary the Messiah should suffer, and die, and rise again, that the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah made it necessary he should. The great objection which the Jews made against Jesus being the Messiah was his ignominious death and sufferings. The cross of Christ was to the Jews a stumbling block, because it did by no means agree with the idea they had framed of the Messiah, but Paul here alleges and makes it out undeniably, not only that it was possible he might be the Messiah, though he suffered, but that, being the Messiah, it was necessary he should suffer. He could not be made perfect but by sufferings, for, if he had not died, he could not have risen again from the dead. This was what Christ himself insisted upon. Lu 24:26 Ought not Christ to have suffered these things, and to enter into his glory? And again, v. 46 Thus it is written, and therefore thus it behoved Christ to suffer, and to rise from the dead. He must needs have suffered for us, because he could not otherwise purchase redemption for us, and he must needs have risen again because he could not otherwise apply the redemption to us. That Jesus is the Messiah, this Jesus whom I preach unto you, and call upon you to believe in, is Christ, is the Christ, is the anointed of the Lord, is he that should come, and you are to look for no other, for God has both by his word and by his works, the two ways of his speaking to the children of men, by the scriptures and by miracles, and the gift of the Spirit to make both effectual, borne witness to him. Gospel ministers should preach Jesus, he must be their principal subject, their business is to bring people acquainted with him. That which we are to preach concerning Jesus is that he is Christ, and therefore we may hope to be saved by him and are bound to be ruled by him.